What if everything you thought you knew about those mysterious men in black suits was just the beginning? Tonight's story comes from a video suggestion by Kelly Dooley, and it's one that will make you question every shadow at your window and every unexplained silence in your neighbourhood. If you enjoy these spine-chilling tales, please like and subscribe to Sleep Theories, and don't forget to leave your own scary story suggestions in the comments below. Now, let's dive into a tale of surveillance, secrets, and the terrifying price of knowing too much. The October wind carried the smell of dying leaves and something else I couldn't quite place as I pulled into the gravel driveway of 1247 Maple Street. Something metallic and stale, like coins left too long in stagnant water. I'd been working welfare checks for Millfield County for 3 years, and that smell usually meant one thing: I was too late. Henry Mallory's house sat like a dark wound against the grey afternoon sky. Every window was covered with what looked like blackout curtains, the kind photographers use, but these were different somehow, thicker, more deliberate. The mailbox overflowed with weeks of accumulated mail, and newspapers in yellow plastic bags lay scattered across the brown lawn like forgotten promises. And I knocked on the front door, calling out the standard greeting I'd rehearsed hundreds of times. "Mr. Mallory, this is Jamie from Millfield County Social Services. We're here for a wellness check." The words echoed back at me, swallowed by the unnatural quiet that seemed to press against the house from all sides. No answer, no movement, not even the shuffle of slippered feet or the distant sound of a television that usually accompanied these visits. I tried the door handle, locked, walked the perimeter, checking windows, looking for any sign of life or entry. The blackout curtains were installed on the inside of every single window, creating an impenetrable barrier between the interior and the outside world. When I pressed my ear against the glass of what might have been a living room window, I heard something that made my skin crawl. The steady hiss of television static playing endlessly like white noise. The spare key was exactly where Mrs. Henderson next door said it would be, under the ceramic frog by the back steps. As I turned it in the lock, that metallic smell hit me full force, and I knew what I was walking into. Henry Mallory sat in a brown recliner facing an old cathode ray television, the screen filled with dancing static. His head was tilted back at an unnatural angle, mouth slightly open, eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. The calendar on the kitchen wall was still turned to October 15th, though today was the 29th. 2 weeks, maybe longer. The house felt wrong in a way that went beyond death. It was too quiet, even accounting for the obvious. No hum of a refrigerator, no ticking clocks, no settling sounds that old houses make. Just that constant static from the television, and a silence so complete it felt like being underwater. I called the coroner and settled in to wait, doing my job of securing the scene and documenting what I found. That's when I really started looking around. Every surface was covered in a thin layer of dust except for well-worn paths between the kitchen, bathroom and living room. But what caught my attention were the notebooks, dozens of them, stacked on every available surface filled with Henry's spidery handwriting. I opened one at random, October 3rd, 2025. Black sedan, licence obscured, parked across street 11:47 p.m. to 4:23 a.m. 2 occupants, no movement. September 28th, 2025. Phone rang 17 times between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. No voice when answered. September 15th, 2025. Footprints in garden, size unknown. Pattern suggests standing in place for extended period. Page after page of similar entries going back months. I flipped to earlier notebooks and found the dates stretched back years, decades even, all documenting the same kinds of things. Unexplained visitors, strange cars, odd occurrences that might seem mundane to anyone else but had clearly consumed Henry Mallory's life. The coroner arrived as the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the spaces between the blackout curtains. Patricia Williams had been doing this job longer than I'd been alive, and she took one look at Henry and shook her head. "Natural causes," she said, checking his pulse points and examining his eyes with a small flashlight. "Heart, probably. Happens all the time with folks his age, especially the isolated ones. Body's been here about 2 weeks, maybe a bit more. As she worked, I found myself drawn to those notebooks, flipping through pages of meticulous documentation that painted a picture of a man living in constant fear of being watched. The handwriting grew shakier in the more recent entries, but never stopped. Right up until the day he died, Henry Mallory had been taking notes. "You okay?" Patricia asked as she finished her examination. "You look pale." "Just the smell," I lied, though the truth was something about this place was getting under my skin. "How long until you can remove the body?" "Van's on the way. Should be another hour or so." She packed her equipment back into her black bag. "You staying to secure the house?" I nodded. It was standard protocol. Someone from the county had to stay until next of kin were notified and arrangements made for securing the property. Henry had a nephew in California who wouldn't arrive for several days, according to our records. After Patricia left, the house seemed to grow even quieter. I wandered through the rooms, clipboard in hand, documenting personal effects for the estate. That's how I found the basement door. It was in a narrow hallway between the kitchen and what had once been a dining room but now served as Henry's filing system. More notebooks, folders full of newspaper clippings, and boxes labelled with dates stretching back to the 1970s. The basement door was painted the same dingy white as the walls, but what made it stand out was the heavy padlock securing it shut. I tried the handle anyway, locked tight. The padlock was new, industrial grade, not something you'd pick up at a hardware store. Someone had wanted to keep that door very securely closed, or keep something very securely contained. I made a note on my report. Basement access secured with padlock. Key location unknown. Will require locksmith for estate inventory. But as I wrote those words, I found myself staring at that door and wondering what Henry Mallory had thought was important enough to lock away so completely. The van arrived to collect Henry's body just as full darkness fell. I helped load him up, signed the necessary paperwork, and watched the taillights disappear down Maple Street. Then I was alone in the house with nothing but static from the television, and the growing certainty that I was missing something important. Before I left, I turned off the television. The silence that followed was so complete, it felt like a physical presence. I stood there for a moment, listening to nothing, then flicked the switch back on. The static resumed, filling the void. Some silences I was learning were worse than noise. I couldn't stop thinking about that padlocked door. 3 days after we'd removed Henry's body, I was back at 1247 Maple Street with a locksmith named Pete, who charged the county $50 to cut through security hardware. The nephew in California had given permission over the phone for a complete inventory of the property, and I was determined to be thorough. "Heavy-duty stuff," Pete muttered as he examined the padlock. Guy really didn't want anyone getting in there. The lock gave way with a sharp crack, and the basement door swung open to reveal wooden stairs descending into darkness. I fumbled for a light switch and found one just inside the doorframe. A single bare bulb illuminated a stairway that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in years. "You want me to stick around?" Pete asked, peering down into the basement. "No, I've got it from here. Thanks." After he left, I stood at the top of those stairs for a long time, flashlight in hand even though the overhead light was working. Something about descending into Henry Mallory's locked basement felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. The stairs creaked under my weight, but they held. The basement was larger than I'd expected, running the full length of the house with a low ceiling and concrete walls that had been painted white decades ago. Now they were stained with moisture and age, creating abstract patterns in the dim light. But what took my breath away were the shelves. They lined every wall, floor to ceiling, packed with VHS tapes in neat rows like a video store from the 1980s. Each tape was labelled in Henry's careful handwriting with dates: March 15th, 1978, August 22nd, 1981, November the 7th, 1985. The dates went on, hundreds of them, stretching from the late 70s all the way up to 2004. In the centre of the basement sat a card table with an old camcorder, the kind that recorded directly to VHS. Beside it were boxes of film reels, some so old the labels had faded to illegibility. More notebooks, these ones bound in black leather, filled with the same spidery handwriting I'd seen upstairs. I pulled one notebook at random and opened it. June 12th, 1983. Witness, Morrison, J. Reports lights over reservoir. Local paper runs story page 3. Black sedan arrives outside Morrison residence June 14th. Morrison recounts story June 15th. New statement, thought it was airplane. June 18th, 1983. Two men in dark suits visit newspaper office. Editor Thompson nervous when asked about Morrison story. Refuses to discuss. June 20th, 1983. Morrison family leaves town suddenly. House sold within week to cash buyer. No forwarding address. Page after page of similar entries, documenting what appeared to be a pattern of witness intimidation following unexplained sightings around Millfield. But it was more than just documentation. Henry had been actively investigating these incidents for decades. I moved to the shelves and pulled a tape at random. September 3rd, 1987 was written on the label in Henry's neat script. Below that, in smaller text, Diner, 2 a.m. There was a VHS player on a small television in the corner of the basement. The setup looked like it hadn't been disturbed in years, but everything was clean, maintained. Henry had been coming down here regularly. I slotted the tape into the player and pressed play. Grainy footage showed the interior of Henry's car at night, dashboard illuminated by streetlights. Through the windshield, I could see the Millfield Diner, a local institution that had been serving coffee and pie to night shift workers and insomniacs for as long as anyone could remember. Henry's voice came through the speaker, younger but recognisable. September 3rd, 1987, 2:15 a.m. Two vehicles in parking lot besides mine, waiting for target to emerge. The camera stayed focused on the diner's front entrance. After several minutes of nothing, a man emerged, middle-aged, wearing work clothes, moving quickly toward a pickup truck parked under a streetlight. Before he could reach his vehicle, two figures approached from the shadows. Tall men in dark suits, their faces difficult to make out in the grainy footage. They moved with an odd, synchronized precision, intercepting the worker before he could reach his truck. I leaned closer to the screen, trying to make out details. The men appeared to be speaking to the worker, though no sound carried from the diner parking lot. Their body language was somehow wrong. Too stiff, too formal for what looked like a chance encounter. The worker's posture changed as they spoke. He went from hurried to rigid, then to something that looked like fear. After several minutes of conversation, one of the suited men gestured toward a black sedan I hadn't noticed parked at the far edge of the lot. The worker followed them to the car. "Jesus," Henry's voice whispered from the tape, "they're taking him." The black sedan pulled out of the parking lot with the worker inside and disappeared down Main Street. The two men in suits got into a second vehicle and followed. Henry's narration continued. Target was Eddie Morrison, age 34, maintenance worker at the power plant. Filed UFO report with county sheriff 2 days ago. Described lights over the plant Tuesday night. Today he gets a visit. The tape ended there. I sat in the dim basement staring at the static-filled screen, trying to process what I'd just seen. Eddie Morrison. That name had been in Henry's notebook upstairs, the one who'd left town suddenly after recanting his UFO story. I looked around at the hundreds of other tapes lining the shelves. How many more stories like Eddie Morrison's were documented here? How long had Henry been watching, recording, documenting these encounters? Near the bottom shelf, one tape stood out from the others. Instead of Henry's usual neat labelling, this one was marked with black marker in urgent uneven letters. Do not destroy. If found, watch. I pulled it from the shelf with hands that were suddenly less steady than I would have liked. The basement felt colder than when I'd first come down, though the October afternoon was mild. As I held that tape, I had the distinct impression that I was about to cross another line, one that might be even harder to come back from than descending into Henry's basement in the first place. But Eddie Morrison's face stayed with me. The way he'd gone from hurried to terrified in the span of a few minutes of conversation, with two men who moved like they weren't entirely human. I needed to know what was on that final tape, but not here. Not in this basement where Henry had spent decades hiding from whatever he'd discovered. I slipped the tape into my jacket pocket and headed for the stairs. leaving the rest of Henry's archive undisturbed for now. As I reached the top of the stairs and prepared to turn off the basement light, I took one last look at those hundreds of tapes. Decades of documentation, a lifetime spent watching the watchers. Henry Mallory hadn't just been a paranoid old man after all, he'd been a chronicler of something much worse. I almost didn't watch the tape that night. I sat in my living room for 2 hours, the VHS cassette on my coffee table like an unexploded bomb, while I tried to convince myself that I was getting carried away. Henry Mallory had been an elderly man living alone, probably dealing with some form of paranoia or dementia. The tape from 1987 could have been staged, or misinterpreted, or any number of rational explanations that didn't involve mysterious men in black suits disappearing people who reported UFO sightings. But I kept thinking about Eddie Morrison's face in that parking lot, the way genuine fear had replaced annoyance when those two men approached him. Around 11 p.m, I finally slid the tape into my VCR. The footage began immediately, no FB warnings or production company logos. Just Henry's voice, older now, speaking in an urgent whisper. October 27th, 2025. If you're watching this, I'm probably dead. My name is Henry James Mallory, and for the past 47 years, I have been documenting the systematic suppression of unexplained phenomena in and around Millfield County. The camera was positioned inside Henry's house, pointing out through a gap in the blackout curtains toward the street. The timestamp in the corner showed 3:47 a.m. They know I have the footage, Henry continued. They've known for years, but something's changed. They're getting bolder, more direct. Through the window I could see a black sedan parked across the street under a broken streetlight. 2 figures stood beside it, perfectly still, facing Henry's house. They've been out there for 6 hours, Henry whispered. Same 2 as always. They don't move, don't talk to each other, don't smoke cigarettes or check their phones like normal surveillance would. They just wait. The camera stayed focused on the scene outside. In the poor lighting it was difficult to make out details of the 2 figures, but something about their posture was deeply unsettling. They stood too straight, too perfectly aligned, like mannequins positioned by someone who had only a theoretical understanding of how humans were supposed to look while waiting. I started filming them in 1978, Henry's narration continued. Back then I thought I was documenting some kind of government cover-up. CIA, NSA, something like that. Men in black suits showing up after UFO sightings to intimidate witnesses. It's a well-known phenomenon. On screen one of the figures turned slightly, and for just a moment the angle of the streetlight illuminated what might have been a face. Pale, angular features that looked somehow wrong, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. But government agents would change shifts. They'd have backup. They'd show signs of fatigue or boredom during long surveillances. These things, they never change. I've filmed the same 2 figures for 47 years and they haven't aged a day. The timestamp jumped forward, 4:23 a.m. The figures hadn't moved. I made mistakes early on, Henry continued. Got too close to witnesses, asked too many questions. That's when they started watching me instead of just cleaning up after sightings. Been living like this for decades now, documenting everything, hoping someone would eventually find the evidence. Another time jump. 5:15 a.m. The figures were gone, but the black sedan remained. The car will stay until sunrise, Henry said, as if reading my thoughts. Then it'll drive away. No engine noise, never any engine noise. And tonight will be just like the last 15,000 nights, except... There was a long pause in the narration. When Henry spoke again, his voice had changed. More tired, resigned. Except I think they're done waiting. I found something 2 days ago. Something that explains what they are and why they're here. I hid it in the usual place, but I don't think that's going to matter anymore. The camera shifted slightly, and I caught a glimpse of Henry's reflection in the window glass. He looked exactly as I'd found him in that recliner. Elderly, frail, wearing the same clothes he'd died in. If you're watching this tape, do not try to find the other footage. Do not ask questions about what happened to the witnesses. Do not go looking for explanations. His voice carried a weight of desperate sincerity. Just walk away. Some knowledge isn't worth having. The tape went to static. I rewound it and watched again, paying closer attention to details I'd missed the first time. The timestamp showed this had been recorded just 2 days before I'd found Henry's body, which meant he'd made this final recording knowing he was about to die. But knowing how? Natural causes, the coroner had said. Heart failure brought on by stress and age. Nothing suspicious about it. On the third viewing, I started taking notes. The license plate on the sedan was obscured, just like in Henry's notebooks. The two figures never made any gestures or movements that looked definitively human. And there was something about the way they stood that reminded me of how store mannequins were positioned. Anatomically correct, but lacking the subtle, unconscious shifts that living people made even when trying to stand perfectly still. I paused the tape when the streetlight briefly illuminated one of the faces and tried to make out features. Pale skin, sharp cheekbones, dark hair. Nothing that would seem unusual in normal circumstances, but in this context everything about them felt wrong. The rational part of my mind kept insisting that this was all explainable. Hidden camera footage from a paranoid elderly man, possibly staged, definitely biased by his preconceived notions about government conspiracies and UFO cover-ups. But another part of my mind, a part I usually tried to ignore, kept thinking about how quiet Henry's house had been. How the silence had felt oppressive, unnatural. How those blackout curtains had been installed with the kind of meticulous care that came from genuine long-term fear. I ejected the tape and sat in my living room until dawn, staring out my own windows at the empty street. No black sedans, no figures standing under streetlights. But for the first time in 3 years of living in this house, I found myself getting up every few minutes to check the locks. I went back to Henry's house the next morning with a box of blank VHS tapes and a portable television. If I was going to understand what had happened to him, I needed to see more of his documentation. The nephew in California had given the county permission to dispose of the contents as we saw fit, which meant I had legal access to everything in that basement archive. What I found was a systematic documentation of 47 years of witness intimidation that followed the same pattern with disturbing consistency. The earliest tapes, dating back to 1978, were filmed with equipment that produced grainy, unstable footage. But even in those early recordings, the same two figures appeared. Always the same black sedan. Always the same methodical approach to witnesses who had reported unexplained phenomena. July 14th, 1979 showed a farming family outside their house being questioned by the suited figures after reporting strange lights over their property. The farmers had initially seemed defiant, but their body language changed as the conversation progressed. By the end of the encounter, they were nodding eagerly, agreeing to something I couldn't hear. March 22nd, 1981 captured footage of the same two figures entering the Millfield Gazette office after the newspaper ran a story about multiple UFO sightings over the reservoir. The editor, who Henry identified in his narration as Thompson, 15 years experience known for integrity, emerged from the meeting looking pale and shaken. November the 8th, 1983, documented the figures visiting a local auto mechanic who'd reported seeing a disc-shaped object hovering over the interstate. The mechanic's initial statement to police had been detailed and confident. After the visit, he claimed he'd been mistaken, probably saw a helicopter. Tape after tape showed the same story. Witnesses reported something unexplained. The story appeared in local media or police reports. The two figures appeared. The witnesses recanted their stories and often left town shortly afterward. But what made my blood run cold was the consistency of the figures themselves. In 1978, they looked exactly the same as in Henry's final tape from 2025. Same height, same build, same angular features when the camera caught them in the right light. 47 years, and they hadn't aged a day. I started cross-referencing Henry's notebooks with the video footage, building a timeline of incidents. The pattern was so consistent it felt almost mechanical. Day 1. Unusual sighting reported day 2 to 3. Story appears in local media or official reports. Day 4 to 5. Black sedan appears in vicinity day 6. Direct contact with witnesses. Day 7. Witness recounts story day 8 to 14. Witness often relocates permanently. but the most disturbing tape was dated September 15th, 1996. This one was different from the others. Instead of filming from his car or house, Henry had positioned the camera in what looked like dense woods. Through the trees, I could see the Millfield Reservoir, its dark surface reflecting a cloudy afternoon sky. September 15th, 1996, Henry's voice whispered from behind the camera. Following up on the Patterson sighting from last week, multiple witnesses reported object emerging from water around midnight September 8th. The camera showed the shoreline, empty except for some scattered fishing equipment left by weekend anglers. Henry's breathing was audible, nervous. Been watching for 3 hours, nothing unusual until a black sedan emerged from the tree line, driving slowly along a dirt access road I hadn't noticed before. It parked near the shoreline, and the two familiar figures got out. But this time, they weren't approaching witnesses. They were alone at the reservoir, and their behaviour was completely different. Instead of their usual rigid, formal posture, they moved with fluid precision, like dancers performing a choreographed routine. They walked to the water's edge and stood perfectly still for several minutes, facing the centre of the reservoir. Then, without any visible signal or communication, they began to undress. I paused the tape, not sure I was ready to see what came next, but I forced myself to continue. The figures removed their clothing with the same synchronised precision they'd shown in every other recording. Underneath their suits, their bodies were pale, almost luminescent in the afternoon light. Too thin, with limbs that seemed slightly too long for their torsos. They walked into the water without hesitation, continuing until they were completely submerged. The reservoir surface showed no ripples, no disturbance of any kind. Henry's camera remained fixed on the water for the next 20 minutes of tape. Nothing happened. No bubbles, no movement, nothing to suggest that two people had just walked into the depths of a 40-foot deep reservoir. Then, at the 23-minute mark, they emerged. But they didn't surface like drowning victims or swimmers coming up for air. They simply appeared at the water's edge, as if they had materialised there. Completely dry. They dressed with the same mechanical precision and returned to their vehicle. As the black sedan drove away, Henry's whispered narration resumed. I don't think they're human. The tape ended there. I sat in Henry's basement for a long time after that, staring at the static-filled screen and trying to process what I'd just seen. Every rational explanation I could think of fell apart under scrutiny. Special effects didn't exist in 1996 that could create that kind of footage, especially not for an amateur filmmaker using a home video camera. I looked around at the hundreds of remaining tapes and realised I'd barely scratched the surface of Henry's documentation. How much more evidence was stored in this basement? How many more incidents had he recorded over nearly 5 decades? But more importantly, if these figures weren't human, what were they? And why had they been systematically suppressing reports of unexplained phenomena in Millfield County for almost 50 years? I selected 3 more tapes at random and settled in to continue watching. Outside, afternoon was fading into evening, but I barely noticed. I was beginning to understand why Henry had covered all his windows with blackout curtains. Some things were better observed from the shadows. The next tape, dated April 7th, 2001, showed the 2 figures visiting an elderly woman at her farmhouse outside town. She had reported seeing lights in formation, moving across her property for 3 consecutive nights. The footage was clearer than the earlier recordings. Henry had upgraded his equipment by then. I watched the figures approach the woman's front door with their characteristic synchronised movement. She answered their knock, spoke with them for approximately 15 minutes, then nodded several times before closing the door. 3 days later, according to Henry's notes, she died of a heart attack. Natural causes, the coroner had ruled. No signs of violence or foul play. But watching the tape, I noticed something chilling about the encounter. During the entire 15-minute conversation, the woman never looked directly at either of the figures. Her eyes remained fixed on a point somewhere between them, as if she was physically unable to make direct eye contact. The 4th tape was even more disturbing. December 23rd, 2003 showed the interior of what I recognised as the Millfield Diner. the same location where Eddie Morrison had been approached 16 years earlier. But this time, the camera was positioned inside the restaurant, apparently hidden among the decorations or equipment. The timestamp showed 11:47 p.m. The diner was nearly empty, just a waitress behind the counter, a cook visible through the kitchen window, and one customer seated at a booth near the back. The customer was a young man, maybe early 20s, wearing a Millfield Community College sweatshirt. He was working on what looked like homework while eating a piece of pie. At 11:52, the two figures entered the diner. They moved to the young man's booth and slid into the seat across from him. Unlike their usual approach to witnesses in parking lots or outside homes, this encounter was happening in public, in front of witnesses. But the waitress and cook continued their work as if nothing unusual was happening. They didn't even glance in the direction of the booth where three people were now engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation. The young man's body language progressed through the same stages I'd seen in other encounters. Initial confusion, growing alarm, then fearful compliance. After approximately 10 minutes, he gathered his books and left the diner with the two figures. The waitress and cook never looked up. It was as if the encounter had been completely invisible to everyone except the target and whoever was operating Henry's hidden camera. I rewound the tape and watched it again, focusing on the background. The waitress moved through her routine, wiping down counters, refilling coffee, checking orders, but her movements had a mechanical quality that reminded me of the figures themselves. The cook was equally robotic, flipping burgers and cleaning the grill with precise, repetitive motions. Neither of them had blinked during the entire encounter. The fifth and final tape I watched that day was dated August 14th, 2004, the most recent in Henry's collection, before the long gap leading up to his final recording in 2025. This one showed Henry himself. The camera was positioned to show a mirror, reflecting Henry as he sat at his kitchen table in the middle of the night. He looked younger than when I'd found his body, but already showed signs of the stress that would consume the final decades of his life. August 14th, 2004, he said to his reflection. I think I understand now what they are and why they're here. He held up a manila folder thick with documents and photographs. It took me 26 years to piece it together, but I finally have enough evidence to prove what's been happening in Millfield County. These aren't government agents. They aren't human at all. Henry opened the folder and spread its contents across the table. Even in the mirror's reflection, I could see newspaper clippings, photographs, and what looked like official documents. They're some kind of watchers. Guardians, maybe. Their job is to maintain the cover-up, to make sure that certain kinds of information never become public knowledge. They've been doing it for decades. Maybe longer. He picked up one of the photographs and held it toward the mirror. It showed the reservoir, but from an angle I didn't recognise. The water was different, clearer, with something visible beneath the surface. The reservoir isn't natural, Henry continued. It was built in 1962 over an existing site. Government records show geological anomalies in the area dating back to the 1940s. Military interest in the region, classified research projects. He set down the photograph and picked up what looked like a government document with heavy black redactions. I think they're guarding something that was discovered here decades ago, something the public can't be allowed to know about. And these two entities, they're part of whatever was found. Henry's reflection looked directly into the camera and I saw genuine terror in his eyes. I'm going to hide this evidence tomorrow. If something happens to me, if they finally decide I know too much, maybe someone will eventually piece together the truth. The tape ended with Henry beginning to repack the folder. I sat in the basement until well after dark, surrounded by decades of documentation that painted a picture so far outside normal reality that I could barely process it. But the evidence was overwhelming, consistent, methodical. Whatever Henry Mallory had discovered, he'd spent the rest of his life documenting it with the dedication of a true believer and the precision of a trained investigator. And now, 21 years later, someone had found his final message. As I packed up the tapes I'd watched and prepared to leave the basement, I noticed something I'd missed earlier. One section of shelving was completely empty, a gap where perhaps a dozen tapes should have been stored. According to the labels on either side of the empty space, the missing tapes covered the period from 2005 to 2025. 20 years of documentation gone. But gone where and when? I had a terrible suspicion that I already knew the answer. I found the final tape 3 days later, not in the basement archive, but sitting on Henry's kitchen counter, where I was certain it hadn't been before. I'd been returning to the house every day, ostensibly to complete the estate inventory, but really to continue reviewing Henry's documentation. Each time I entered, I made a mental note of how everything was positioned, a habit that had developed from 3 years of conducting welfare checks in homes where details mattered. The tape sat next to the coffee maker, labelled in Henry's familiar handwriting, October 25th, 2025, final entry, 2 days before I'd found his body. My hands shook as I carried it down to the basement and slid it into the VHS player. The footage began immediately, showing Henry in his living room, looking directly into the camera. Behind him, every window was covered with the blackout curtains, creating a cave-like atmosphere even in what appeared to be daylight. October 25th, 2025, Henry began, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of exhaustion. This will be my final recording. They're done waiting. He gestured toward the curtained windows. They've been outside for 6 days now. Not just at night anymore. Constant surveillance. 2 shifts, different vehicles, but always the same entities. The camera angle shifted, showing Henry's view through a gap in the curtains. A black sedan sat across the street, 2 familiar figures standing beside it in the bright afternoon sun. But now there was also a dark SUV parked at the corner, with 2 more figures visible near it. 4 of them now, Henry continued. In 47 years of watching, I've never seen more than 2 at a time. Something's changed. He moved back to his chair and I could see the stress of decades etched into his face. But there was also something else, a kind of resigned determination. I need to tell you about 1977, he said. The year before I started filming. The year everything began. Henry reached for a manila folder, the same one I'd seen in his 2004 recording. July 19th, 1977. I was working construction on the new water treatment facility. Standard job, nothing unusual about it. But we were digging foundation trenches near the old reservoir when we hit something that wasn't on any of the geological surveys. He opened the folder and pulled out a black and white photograph that he held toward the camera. It showed what looked like an excavation site, with several men in hard hats standing around a deep trench. Metal, Henry said, but not like any metal we'd ever seen. Dark, almost black, with a surface that seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. The shape was geometric, perfect angles, mathematical precision, obviously artificial. He set down the photograph and picked up what appeared to be an official document. Foreman called the county engineer called the state called someone in Washington. By the next morning, we had federal agents on site telling us the excavation was being classified under national security. Henry's voice grew bitter. They told us we'd been digging near an old military testing site. Unexploded ordnance, they said. Dangerous to continue. We were all sworn to secrecy, paid double our contracted rate, and told to find work elsewhere. He pulled out another photograph, this one showing the excavation site after it had been backfilled and covered with concrete. But I was curious. Started asking questions around town about the old military testing. Problem was, nobody knew anything about any military activity in the area. No records at the county office. No stories from old-timers who would have remembered. It was like the whole story had been fabricated. The camera angle shifted again, showing Henry's view of the street. The figures outside hadn't moved, but somehow they seemed closer than before. That's when I started paying attention to things that didn't quite fit. Strange lights, people reported, but that never made it into the newspaper. Witnesses who suddenly left town after talking to authorities. A pattern of suppression that had been going on for years before I noticed it. Henry turned back to the camera and I could see genuine fear in his eyes now. The thing is, I don't think they found what was buried that day. I think what was buried found them. He reached into the folder one more time and pulled out a document I hadn't seen before. a map of Millfield County with several locations marked in red ink. I've been tracking the incidents for 47 years, and they all centre around specific geographic points. The reservoir, obviously, but also the old grain elevator on Route 9, the abandoned mining complex east of town, and the county landfill. Henry traced the marked locations with his finger. All of these sites show the same pattern of witness suppression. All of them have underground components, basement levels, mining tunnels, deep excavations, and all of them are connected by what the geological surveys call natural aquifer systems. He looked directly into the camera. I don't think they're natural at all. I think they're part of something larger, something that's been under Millfield County for a very long time. The tape jumped forward several hours. The timestamp now showed 11:47 p.m, and Henry looked exhausted. "They're moving," he said simply. Through the gap in the curtains, I could see both vehicles had repositioned themselves. The black sedan was now directly in front of Henry's house, while the SUV had moved to the back alley. The four figures had formed a perimeter around the property. "I found something yesterday," Henry continued, "in the basement of the old grain elevator. Been exploring these sites for years, but this was different. There's a chamber down there, filled with the same black metal we found in 1977. He held up a small object, roughly cylindrical, about the size of a flashlight, made of the same light-absorbing material he had described. But this was sitting on a table in the centre of the chamber, like someone left it there for me to find. Henry turned the object in his hands, and I could see symbols etched into its surface, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and move in the camera's light. When I touched it, I saw things, understood things. This isn't just about covering up UFO sightings or maintaining some government secret. This is about keeping something contained, something that's been trying to communicate with the surface world for decades. The object began to emit a faint glow, barely visible in the dim lighting of Henry's living room. The entities outside, they're not aliens or government agents, they're guardians, part of a containment system that's been in place since whatever's down there was first discovered. And the people who report sightings, who get too close to the truth, they're not just being silenced. Henry's voice dropped to a whisper. They're being recruited. The glow from the object intensified, and Henry set it carefully on the table beside his chair. I understand now why the witnesses leave town, where they go, what they become. The sightings aren't random events. They're calls for help. Communications from something that's been trapped underground for God knows how long. Outside, the four figures had begun moving toward the house. "And now it's my turn," Henry said, standing up from his chair. "I've learned too much, documented too much. But maybe that was always the plan. Maybe someone was supposed to find the evidence eventually." The camera remained fixed on Henry as he moved toward his front door. Through the curtained windows, I could see flashlight beams moving across the walls. "If you're watching this, you have a choice," Henry said, his hand on the doorknob. "You can try to expose what I've discovered. Publish the tapes, contact the media, get the truth out there. But they'll find you, just like they found me." The flashlight beams were getting brighter, and I could hear the sound of footsteps on Henry's front porch. Or you can do what I should have done 47 years ago. Walk away, forget what you've seen. Let the containment system do its job. Henry opened the door. The tape went to static. I sat in the basement for a long time after the recording ended, staring at the dead screen and trying to process what I'd just witnessed. According to the timestamp, this footage had been recorded less than 48 hours before I'd found Henry's body in his living room. But the coroner had ruled it natural causes, heart failure, no signs of violence or struggle. I rewound the tape and watched the final moments again, looking for details I'd missed. When Henry opened the door, there was a brief glimpse of the figures outside. Tall, pale, wearing their characteristic dark suits. But in that instant before the tape cut to static, I caught something I hadn't noticed before. They weren't alone. Behind them, barely visible in the darkness, stood other figures, dozens of them, forming a crowd that stretched beyond the range of the camera. Men and women of various ages, all wearing the same dark clothing, all standing with the same rigid posture I'd seen in Henry's surveillance footage. Eddie Morrison was among them. I was certain of it, even though the footage was too brief and dark to make out specific faces. The same build, the same work clothes I'd seen in the 1987 diner footage. How many witnesses had been recruited over the decades? How many missing persons cases could be explained by whatever process Henry had discovered? And now they had come for him. Why leave his body to be found? Why not make Henry disappear like all the others? The answer came to me as I ejected the tape and looked around at Henry's massive archive. They wanted someone to find the evidence. 47 years of documentation, carefully preserved and organised, waiting for the right person to discover it. Someone like me. I turned off the basement lights and climbed the stairs, the final tape clutched in my hand. At the top I paused and looked back down into the darkness. Henry had spent nearly half a century documenting a containment system designed to suppress knowledge of something buried beneath Millfield County. Something that communicated through unexplained phenomena trying to reach the surface world, and now I had become part of that system. The question was, what was I going to do about it? I started asking questions the next day, against every instinct screaming at me to walk away, to forget everything I'd seen in Henry's basement. I began reaching out to people who might have known him. I told myself I was just being thorough, completing the welfare check investigation properly. The truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about that crowd of figures standing behind the two guardians at Henry's door. All those missing witnesses recruited into whatever system had been containing the thing beneath Millfield County. My first stop was Mrs. Henderson, the neighbour who had provided Henry's spare key location. She was in her 70s, a retired schoolteacher who had lived on Maple Street for most of her adult life. "Poor Henry," she said, serving me coffee in her immaculate kitchen. "Always seemed like such a troubled man. Paranoid, you know. Always peeking through those awful curtains, writing in those notebooks. Did he ever talk to you about what he was documenting?" Mrs. Henderson pursed her lips. "Oh, he tried to, especially in the early years, going on about government conspiracies and mysterious visitors. I told him he was watching too much television." "What kind of mysterious visitors?" "Men in suits," he claimed. Said they were watching him, intimidating people who reported strange things. Nonsense, of course. This is Millfield County. Nothing mysterious ever happens here. But as she spoke, I noticed her hands trembling slightly as she poured the coffee. And when I asked if she'd ever seen any unusual activity around Henry's house, her answer came too quickly. "Nothing at all. Very quiet neighbourhood. I mind my own business." I left her house with the distinct impression that Mrs. Henderson knew more than she was willing to admit, but whether that was from fear or something else I couldn't tell. My next stop was the Millfield Gazette, where I hoped to find archives of the UFO reports Henry had referenced in his documentation. The current editor, a young woman named Lisa Parker, was helpful but puzzled. "We don't really cover that kind of story anymore," she said, scrolling through digital archives on her computer. "Liability issues, you know. People make wild claims, we print them, then they sue us when nothing comes of it. What about historical reports? Say from the 1980s or 1990s. Lisa frowned at her screen. "That's strange. We should have digital copies of everything from 1975 forward, but there are gaps, whole weeks missing from some years." She pulled up what appeared to be a filing system showing years and months. Large sections were greyed out, marked as archived or unavailable. "I've never noticed this before," she muttered. "Let me check the physical archives." 20 minutes later, she returned from the basement storage area looking confused. "This doesn't make sense. We have boxes for every year, but some of them are nearly empty, like someone went through and removed specific issues." "Which years?" Lisa consulted her notes. "Scattered throughout the 80s and 90s, and," she paused, checking again, 2001, 2003, 2004, almost nothing from those years. The same years when Henry's documentation showed increased activity from the Guardians. I thanked Lisa and left the newspaper office, but I could feel her watching me through the front window as I walked to my car. In the reflection of the glass, I caught a glimpse of someone else watching from across the street. A tall figure in a dark suit standing perfectly still beside a black sedan. My heart rate spiked, but when I turned for a direct look, the street was empty. That afternoon, I drove to the Millfield Diner and spoke with the evening manager, an older man named Carl who had worked there for over 20 years. I asked about Eddie Morrison, the maintenance worker from Henry's 1987 footage. Eddie Morrison, Carl repeated, scratching his head. Name sounds familiar, but I can't place him. You sure he worked around here? He was a regular customer, apparently. Used to come in late at night. Carl's expression changed slightly. Oh, you mean late shift, Eddie? Yeah, I remember him now. Quiet guy, kept to himself. Stopped coming around suddenly. Must have been the late 80s or early 90s. Do you know what happened to him? Moved away, I think. People do that sometimes. Get tired of small-town life, head for the city. But Carl avoided eye contact as he spoke, and his voice carried the same forced casualness I'd heard from Mrs. Henderson. I ordered coffee and sat in the same booth where I'd seen Eddie Morrison confronted by the Guardians. The diner felt normal. Typical small-town restaurant with checkered floors and outdated decor. But I found myself studying the other customers, looking for signs of the mechanical behaviour I'd seen in Henry's footage. Nothing seemed unusual until I got up to leave. As I paid my bill, I noticed Carl watching me with an intensity that seemed out of proportion to a simple customer interaction. When our eyes met, he looked away quickly, but not before I caught something in his expression that looked like recognition, like he knew exactly why I was asking questions about Eddie Morrison. I drove home as the sun was setting, checking my rearview mirror constantly for black sedans. The streets of Millfield seemed normal. Light traffic, people heading home from work, kids playing in front yards. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That feeling intensified when I pulled into my driveway. Sitting on my front porch was a manila envelope with my name written on it in block letters. No postmark, no return address. Someone had delivered it by hand. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. Stop asking questions about Henry Mallory. Some knowledge is dangerous. This is your only warning. Below the text was a photograph, a black and white image showing me leaving the newspaper office that afternoon. In the background, barely visible in the shadow of a building, stood two tall figures in dark suits. I went inside and deadbolted the door, then checked every window to make sure they were locked. The rational part of my mind insisted that this was just someone playing an elaborate prank, perhaps inspired by Henry's well-known paranoia. But the photograph was real, and the timing, delivered within hours of my investigation, suggested a level of surveillance that went far beyond anything a prankster could manage. I made dinner but couldn't eat it. Every sound outside made me jump. Cars passing, neighbours talking, the wind moving through the trees, normal suburban noises that suddenly felt threatening. Around 10 p.m, I turned off all the lights and peered through my living room curtains at the street outside. A black sedan was parked across from my house. Two figures stood beside it, perfectly still facing my front door. In the dim light from the street lamp, I could make out their characteristic tall, thin builds and dark suits. They weren't trying to hide their presence. If anything, they seemed to want me to see them. I watched for an hour and they never moved, never spoke to each other, never showed any of the restless behaviours that normal surveillance teams would display during a long watch. At 11:15, I decided to test them. I turned on my porch light and stepped outside, making no attempt at stealth. If they were watching me, they would know I was coming. The moment I appeared on my porch, both figures turned their heads toward me with mechanical precision. Even from across the street I could see their pale faces and dark eyes. They stood perfectly aligned, like mirror images of each other. "Can I help you?" I called out, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. They didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there watching me with a kind of absolute stillness that no living person could maintain. I took a step toward the street, and they both took a step backward, maintaining the exact same distance between us. Another step forward, another synchronized step back. It was like some kind of bizarre dance, with invisible rules that kept us in perfect equilibrium. "What do you want?" I shouted. This time one of them, impossible to tell which in the poor lighting, spoke. The voice carried clearly across the distance, but it had an odd quality. Too precise, like someone reading from a script. "Return to your house. Discontinue your investigation. This is your final warning." The words were completely clear, but something about them felt wrong. The cadence was off. as if the speaker was mimicking human speech without fully understanding its natural rhythm. What happened to Henry Mallory? Mr. Mallory chose to join the containment protocol. The same choice is available to you. What containment protocol? What are you containing? But instead of answering, both figures turned away from me and got into their vehicle. The car pulled away from the curb and disappeared down the street without making a sound. No engine noise, just like Henry had described in his recordings. I stood on my porch for several more minutes, staring at the empty street and trying to process what had just happened. The conversation, if it could be called that, had felt completely surreal. Like talking to sophisticated automatons that had been programmed with just enough human behaviour to maintain a conversation, but not enough to seem genuinely alive. Back inside, I double-checked all my locks and closed every curtain. Then I sat in my living room with the lights off, thinking about what the figure had said. Mr. Mallory chose to join the containment protocol. Not that he had died. Not that he had been eliminated for knowing too much. That he had chosen to join something, and the same choice was available to me. I thought about that crowd of figures I'd seen in Henry's final recording. All those missing witnesses standing behind the Guardians like a silent army. Had they all made the same choice? And if so, what exactly were they containing? Outside, the street remained quiet, but I had the distinct feeling that this was far from over. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my darkened living room, periodically checking the windows for any sign of the black sedan's return. Around 3 a.m, I made a decision that would have seemed insane just a week earlier. I was going to document everything just like Henry had. If something happened to me, if I chose to join the containment protocol or simply disappeared like so many witnesses before me, at least there would be a record. I set up my smartphone to record and positioned it on the coffee table, where it could capture both me and the view out my front window. Then I began to tell my story, starting with the welfare check that had led me to Henry Mallory's basement archive. I talked for 2 hours, describing everything I'd seen in his recordings, the pattern of witness intimidation, the strange behaviour of the Guardians, and my own growing certainty that something had been hidden beneath Millfield County for decades. When I finished, I uploaded the video to 3 different cloud storage services and emailed copies to friends in other states. If the Guardians could scrub newspaper archives and make entire video channels disappear overnight, I wanted to make sure this record would be harder to erase. The next morning, I drove to the one location Henry had mentioned that I hadn't yet visited, the old grain elevator on Route 9. The structure had been abandoned for at least 20 years, a massive concrete tower surrounded by rusted storage silos and overgrown with weeds. A chain-link fence topped with barbed wire surrounded the property, but age and weather had created several gaps large enough to slip through. I parked a half-mile away and approached on foot, carrying a flashlight and the smartphone I'd used for my recording the night before. If Henry had found something in the basement of this building, I needed to see it for myself. The main elevator building was 4 stories tall, with broken windows and graffiti covering most of the accessible surfaces. But what I was looking for would be underground, in the basement levels that Henry had mentioned. I found a service entrance on the north side of the building that had been secured with a padlock very similar to the one on Henry's basement door. The lock was old and rusted, and it gave way after several minutes of work with a crowbar I'd brought from my car. The door opened onto a concrete stairwell that descended into absolute darkness. My flashlight beam revealed steps leading down at least 2 levels, with water-stained walls and the musty smell of long abandonment. The first basement level was what I'd expected. Old machinery, storage rooms filled with obsolete equipment, the normal detritus of an industrial facility that had been shut down decades ago. But at the far end of the main corridor I found another stairwell leading deeper underground. This second basement was different. The walls were made of the same black metal Henry had described from the 1977 excavation. Smooth, geometrically precise surfaces that seemed to absorb my flashlight beam rather than reflect it. The corridor extended in both directions beyond the range of my light, but I could see doorways at regular intervals. I chose the left corridor and began exploring. The first door I came to was standing open, revealing a circular chamber about 20 feet in diameter. The walls, floor and ceiling were all made of the same light-absorbing material, covered with intricate geometric patterns that seemed to shift and move in my flashlight beam. In the centre of the room sat a table, or what I assumed was a table. It was integrated into the floor, rising from the black metal surface like it had been grown rather than built. On top of it lay several objects similar to the cylindrical device Henry had shown in his final recording. I approached carefully, recording everything with my phone. The objects were warm to the touch, despite the cold temperature of the underground chamber. As I picked up one of them, symbols began to appear on its surface, the same geometric patterns that covered the walls. Then I heard voices, human voices coming from deeper in the corridor. Multiple people engaged in what sounded like a conversation, though I couldn't make out words from this distance. I turned off my flashlight and followed the sound, using my phone's screen to provide just enough illumination to avoid walking into walls. The voices grew clearer as I approached, and I began to recognise what I was hearing. It was Henry's voice, along with others I didn't recognise, all speaking in the same measured, precise cadence I'd heard from the guardian outside my house the night before. The corridor ended in a much larger chamber, this one filled with what looked like workstations. Dozens of people sat at tables similar to the one I'd found in the smaller room, all handling the cylindrical objects, all speaking in those same careful, scripted voices. I recognised several faces from Henry's documentation. Eddie Morrison was there, looking exactly as he had in the 1987 diner footage, despite nearly 40 years having passed. The young college student from the 2003 recording sat at a nearby table, also unchanged by time, and at the centre of the chamber, directing the activities with quiet authority, was Henry Mallory. He looked up from his work as I entered the chamber, and our eyes met across the room. For a moment his expression showed a flicker of the man I'd seen in the basement recordings. Frightened, desperate, human. Then it shifted to the same blank efficiency I'd observed in all the others. "Jamie," he said, his voice carrying that odd precision, "we've been expecting you." I took an involuntary step backward, but found my path blocked by two familiar figures. The guardians from my front porch stood behind me, their pale faces showing no emotion. "You have questions," Henry continued, standing up from his workstation. "That's natural. I had questions too when I first discovered this place." "What is this?" I managed to ask. "What are you doing down here?" "We're maintaining the containment," Henry said, gesturing around the chamber, "preventing the surface world from learning about what lies beneath. It's important work. Necessary work." "You're dead," I said. "I found your body. The coroner ruled it natural causes." Henry smiled, but it was wrong somehow. Too wide, too controlled. Death is just another transition. Another form of service. We who have learned too much, who have seen too much, were given the opportunity to become part of the solution instead of part of the problem. Around the chamber, the other workers continued their activities with mechanical precision. No one looked up from their tasks. No one showed any curiosity about my presence or the conversation taking place. "The objects we work with," Henry continued, picking up one of the cylindrical devices, "they're communication tools, translators. They allow us to interface with the entity that has been contained here since 1962. "What entity?" "Something that fell from the sky in 1947. Something that the government tried to study and couldn't understand. They built the reservoir over the crash site, thinking they could contain it with water and concrete. But it continued to communicate, continued to try to reach the surface world." Henry held up the device, and symbols began appearing on its surface. Every UFO sighting, every unexplained phenomenon reported in this county, their attempts at communication, messages trying to reach someone who could understand, and every time someone got too close to the truth, the containment protocol was activated. "So you silence them, make them disappear." "We recruit them," Henry corrected. "We give them the opportunity to understand, to become part of something larger than themselves." Around the chamber I could see dozens of workstations, each occupied by someone who had supposedly disappeared over the past several decades, all working with the same focused determination, all speaking in the same precise cadence. "What's it like?" I asked. "Being part of this containment protocol?" Henry's expression flickered again, and for just a moment I saw genuine emotion there. Fear, sadness, regret, "It's peaceful," he said, but his voice wavered slightly. "No more questions, no more uncertainty, just purpose." But as he spoke, I noticed something that chilled me more than anything I'd seen so far. Tears were running down Henry's face, even as he smiled and spoke about peace and purpose. The containment protocol hadn't just recruited him, it had trapped him. All of them. "I don't want to join," I said. "That's what I said," Henry replied, "but you will, eventually. The alternative is much worse." The two guardians stepped closer and I felt their cold hands on my shoulders, but instead of forcing me toward one of the workstations, they simply stood there, waiting. "The choice is yours," Henry said. "Join the containment protocol willingly and maintain some small part of who you were. Resist and become something else entirely." I looked around the chamber at all the missing witnesses, all the people who had supposedly chosen to join this underground operation. None of them looked up. None of them showed any sign of individual will or personality. But Henry's tears told a different story. "There's a third option," I said, "which is, I leave. I walk out of here. I never speak of what I've seen." Henry shook his head. "Too late for that. You've seen too much, learned too much. The containment protocol cannot allow that knowledge to exist outside our control." But even as he spoke, I could see doubt in his eyes, and I realized something that might be important. "You want me to choose the third option," I said. "You're hoping I'll find a way out that you couldn't." Henry's smile faltered completely. "Don't," he whispered. "Don't give them any reason to doubt your compliance." But it was too late. The guardians had heard, and their grip on my shoulders tightened. As they began to guide me toward an empty workstation, I made my own choice. I ran. I made it as far as the first basement level before they caught me. The guardians moved with inhuman speed, their footsteps completely silent on the concrete floors. When they grabbed me again, their hands were no longer cold. They burned like ice, and I could feel something changing in my body wherever they touched. They dragged me back to the chamber where Henry and the others continued their work, seemingly oblivious to my attempted escape. But as the guardians forced me into a chair at an empty workstation, Henry looked up from his own work and met my eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, and this time his voice sounded completely human. "I tried to warn you." One of the guardians placed a cylindrical device in my hands. The moment my fingers closed around it, symbols began appearing on its surface, and I heard something that wasn't quite a voice speaking directly into my mind. "Welcome," it said. "We have been waiting for you." Images flooded my consciousness. The thing that had crashed in 1947, the government's attempts to study and contain it, the decades of communication attempts that had been systematically suppressed. I saw the truth of what the containment protocol really was. Not protection of the surface world from an alien entity. Protection of the entity from the surface world. The thing beneath Millfield County wasn't trying to escape or invade. It was dying, slowly, from decades of isolation and containment. The UFO sightings, the unexplained phenomena, they were distress calls from a being that was trapped as surely as any of the human workers in this underground chamber. The Guardians weren't protecting humanity from an alien threat. They were protecting a government cover-up that had lasted over 70 years. "Help us," the voice continued, "help us return home." And suddenly I understood what my real choice was. I could join the containment protocol, become another worker in this underground facility, and spend whatever remained of my existence helping to maintain a lie that served no one. Or I could help the entity do what it had been trying to do for decades, communicate with the outside world. I looked around the chamber at all the people who had been recruited over the years. Henry, Eddie Morrison, the college student, dozens of others, all of them working with mechanical precision to maintain the containment. But as I watched more carefully, I noticed something the Guardians had missed. Subtle glances between the workers, hand signals passed when the Guardians weren't looking. Micro expressions that suggested more awareness than they were supposed to have. The containment protocol wasn't perfect. Some part of these people's original personalities remained, buried beneath the compulsion to serve but not entirely destroyed, including Henry. When our eyes met again, he gave an almost imperceptible nod towards something behind me. I glanced back without moving my head and saw what he was indicating. A communication panel built into the wall connected to the surface world. The entity's voice continued in my mind, showing me images of its home, its people, the desperate need to re-establish contact with those who had sent it to Earth decades ago. They told your people we were invaders. We were explorers, scientists. Peaceful contact was always our intention. I made my decision. Instead of accepting the role of containment worker, I reached for the communication panel. The moment my hand touched the controls, alarms began blaring throughout the chamber. The Guardians moved toward me with their inhuman speed, but the other workers suddenly rose from their stations. For the first time since I'd entered this underground facility, they acted like human beings instead of automatons. Eddie Morrison tackled one Guardian while the college student disabled another. Henry himself moved to help me with the communication equipment. "Hurry," he said, his voice urgent and completely human now. "The compulsion is strong. We can't fight it for long." I input the emergency broadcast codes I'd learned during my county training, patching the chamber's communication system into every radio and television frequency in the area. Then I stepped back and let the entity speak for itself. The broadcast lasted exactly 17 minutes. 17 minutes of first contact, broadcast live across 3 counties. The entity's voice translated through the cylindrical devices, speaking directly to anyone who was listening, explaining its peaceful intentions, its decades of imprisonment, its desperate need to return home. The Guardians eventually overcame the resistance of the recruited workers and shut down the broadcast, but it was too late. The truth was out there, recorded on hundreds of devices, witnessed by thousands of people. For the first time in over 70 years, the containment protocol had failed. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within hours, the entire underground facility was evacuated by federal agents. The recruited workers, including Henry, were transferred to undisclosed locations. The grain elevator was demolished and the site covered with concrete. Official sources claimed the broadcast had been an elaborate hoax, possibly connected to terrorist activity. Anyone who tried to share recordings found their files corrupted or their accounts suspended. The story disappeared from news coverage within 48 hours, but not completely. I escaped during the evacuation, slipping away while the agents were focused on securing the facility and transporting the workers. I had 17 minutes of audio from the entity's broadcast saved on my phone, and copies hidden in cloud storage accounts the authorities hadn't yet discovered. More importantly, I had the truth. The entity had provided coordinates for its homeworld, mathematical proofs of its peaceful intentions, and detailed information about technologies that could revolutionize human understanding of physics and space travel. All of it suppressed by a containment protocol that served no one except the people who had built their careers on maintaining a 70-year-old lie. I tried to release the information through traditional channels, news outlets, scientific journals, government representatives. Every attempt was blocked, censored, or discredited before it could gain traction. But the internet is a harder thing to control completely. Anonymous accounts, encrypted files, peer-to-peer networks that existed outside government oversight. Slowly, carefully, I began sharing fragments of the truth. Not all at once. That would have been too easy to dismiss as fraud. But piece by piece, building a pattern that people could discover for themselves. UFO enthusiasts found the audio recordings. Scientists encountered the mathematical proofs. Government transparency advocates uncovered documents related to the 1947 crash and subsequent cover-up. Each piece of evidence was authentic, verifiable, impossible to completely suppress. 3 months after the failed containment protocol, a new pattern began emerging. Instead of isolated sightings that could be dismissed or intimidated into silence, coordinated contact events started occurring worldwide. The entity I'd helped contact had shared Earth's location and situation with its people. First contact wasn't a single event. It was an ongoing process that no government could control or contain. I still live in Millfield County, though I've moved to a different house on the other side of town. Sometimes I see black sedans in my neighbourhood, and occasionally I notice figures in dark suits watching me from a distance. But they don't approach anymore. The containment protocol is broken, and trying to silence individual witnesses is pointless when the truth has taken on a life of its own. Last week I received a package with no return address. Inside was a VHS tape labelled simply, "Thank you." The footage showed Henry Mallory sitting in what appeared to be a comfortable room with large windows overlooking a garden. He looked peaceful, genuinely relaxed for the first time in any recording I'd seen. Behind him, I could see other people I recognised from the underground chamber. Eddie Morrison, the college student, all the recruited witnesses. They were free. The entity kept its promise, Henry said to the camera. When contact was re-established with its people, they came for all of us. We're being taken home, not to their world, but to a place where we can live without the compulsion, without the containment protocol controlling our minds. He smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. "You did the right thing, Jamie. The truth was worth the risk. It's always worth the risk." The tape ended with a view of the garden where former witnesses walked freely, talking and laughing like human beings instead of automatons. I keep that tape in a safe place, along with copies of all the evidence I've managed to preserve. Not because I think anyone will try to take it from me, the time for that kind of suppression has passed, but because it reminds me that even the most carefully constructed lies eventually fall apart when confronted with enough truth. The entity and its people are still here, working openly with human scientists and governments to establish formal diplomatic relations. The technology they've shared has already begun revolutionizing our understanding of physics, medicine, and space travel. And somewhere in the files of a dozen different agencies, there are records of the people who spent 70 years maintaining a containment protocol that served no purpose except to protect the careers of those who had created it. Henry Mallory was right about one thing. They never do leave you alone once you've learned too much. But sometimes, if you're very careful and very lucky, you can make sure the truth survives long enough to set everyone free, including yourself. The blackout curtains are gone from my windows now. I sleep with the lights off and the doors unlocked. The shadows no longer hide watchers, and the silence is just silence. But every night before I go to bed, I look up at the stars and remember that we're not alone anymore. And that's a truth worth any price. Welcome back to Sleep Theories, where we dive deep into the mysteries that keep us awake at night. Before we begin tonight's story, I want to give a special thanks to DXD232 for this incredible video suggestion. If you have ideas for future stories, please leave them in the comments below. Your suggestions fuel these late-night journeys into the unknown. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories. It really helps us continue bringing you these haunting tales. Now, settle in as we explore what happens when family secrets and government conspiracies collide in ways that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the truth. The rain drummed against the chapel windows like fingers tapping out Morse code. Urgent, persistent, demanding attention. I sat in the front pew, staring at the flag-draped casket that held my grandfather, Colonel James Mitchell, United States Air Force, retired. The chaplain's words washed over me like white noise, meaningless platitudes about service and sacrifice that felt hollow in the echoing space. Grandpa Jim had always been a quiet man, the kind who could fill a room with his presence while saying nothing at all. His steel-grey eyes held secrets that I'd never been curious enough to ask about, and now those secrets were buried with him. Or so I thought. The military honour guard folded the flag with mechanical precision, each crease sharp enough to cut glass. When they handed it to me, the only family he had left, the weight of it seemed heavier than cloth and thread should be. 21 rifle shots cracked through the cemetery air, and I watched them lower my grandfather into the ground, taking with him 40 years of classified service that he'd never once discussed at family dinners. After the service, I stood alone by his grave as the other mourners drifted away like ghosts in the mist. Most were elderly veterans from his old squadron, men with weathered faces and knowing looks, who shook my hand with grips that still held strength despite their age. A few whispered condolences, but I noticed how they glanced at each other when they thought I wasn't looking. Shared glances that spoke of things unspoken. "He was a good man," said one particularly ancient veteran, his chest heavy with decades of ribbons and medals. Kept his promises right to the end. There was something in the way he said it, an emphasis that made me wonder what promises he meant. The house felt different when I returned. Emptier, yes, but also somehow expectant, as if it were holding its breath. Grandpa Jim had lived here for 30 years, ever since Grandma passed, and every corner held memories of weekend visits and summer vacations. But now those memories felt incomplete, like photographs with faces cut out. I spent the next few days making arrangements, contacting lawyers, sorting through paperwork, deciding what to keep and what to donate. It was during this methodical dismantling of a life that I found myself standing in his bedroom, looking up at the attic access panel I'd never paid attention to before. The wooden ladder creaked under my weight as I climbed up, flashlight in hand. The attic was exactly what you'd expect. Dusty boxes, old furniture covered in sheets, the detritus of a long life lived quietly. But as I moved deeper into the space, something caught my eye. In the far corner, beneath what looked like perfectly normal floorboards, there was a slight depression, as if the wood had been cut and replaced. My fingers found the edges easily once I knew what to look for. The section of flooring lifted away to reveal a hiding place that had been carefully constructed decades ago. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth like a treasure map from some childhood adventure, was a briefcase. It was military issue, the kind of hard-sided case that could survive a nuclear blast. The locks were old but well maintained, and they opened with a satisfying click when I worked the combination. Grandma's birthday, because of course it was. Inside, the briefcase was divided into neat compartments, each holding documents that made my hands shake as I lifted them out. Top Secret Majestic 12 was stamped across every page in red ink that had faded to the colour of dried blood. The papers were yellowed with age but perfectly preserved, as if time had forgotten they existed. Most were typed on letterheads I didn't recognise, organisations with names like Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program and Project Blue Book Special Studies Group. But it was the photograph that stopped my breathing entirely. 12 men in military uniforms and dark suits, standing in formation like they were posing for history. The setting looked official, some kind of government building with marble columns visible in the background. They all had the bearing of men accustomed to power, to making decisions that shaped the world from shadows. I recognised a few faces from history books: General Nathan Twining, Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter, officials whose names I'd heard in connection with early UFO investigations. But there in the back row, younger than the others and wearing an Air Force dress uniform, was my grandfather. The back of the photograph was annotated in careful handwriting. The Committee, 1952. Below that, in different ink and what looked like a different hand, J. Mitchell, inducted 1962, Project Doorway. I spent the next 3 hours reading everything in that briefcase, and each document pulled me deeper into a reality I'd never imagined. There were incident reports from radar stations across the southwest, describing objects that moved in ways that defied physics. Photographs of wreckage that looked like nothing I'd ever seen, metal that seemed to flow like liquid mercury, but held its shape like steel. Witness testimonies from pilots, air traffic controllers, and civilians who'd seen things in the sky that officially didn't exist. But the most unsettling document was a simple roster, typed on official letterhead from something called Majestic 12 Operations Command. 12 names were listed in alphabetical order, each followed by their service branch, rank, and what appeared to be a security clearance level that went beyond anything in the public domain. Most of the names I could research later: generals and admirals, a few scientists from Los Alamos and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, men who'd built America's military-industrial complex from the ground up. But one name, the 7th on the list, was completely blacked out with what looked like permanent marker. Even on a document that was clearly decades old, someone had taken the time to obscure that particular identity. At the bottom of the page, handwritten in my grandfather's distinctive script, was an addition: James R. Mitchell, Colonel, USAF, inducted March 15, 1962, clearance level, Umbra. The date meant something. 1962 was the year my father was born, the year my grandparents bought this house. It was when Grandpa Jim's career took a sudden upward trajectory that I'd never really questioned before. One day he was a squadron commander at a routine airbase. The next he was being reassigned to positions that sounded important, but which he never talked about. Liaison work, he'd always said when I asked. Coordinating between different departments. Now I understood that his vague answers hadn't been modesty. They'd been security protocols. The more I read, the more questions multiplied. There were references to recovered materials and non-terrestrial technology. Meeting minutes discussed containment procedures and public information management. One particularly chilling memo, dated 1963, discussed the termination protocols for individuals who posed security risks to the program. But what disturbed me most was how recent some of the documents were. The briefcase contained papers dating all the way up to 1995, 3 years before my grandfather's official retirement. Whatever Majestic 12 was, it hadn't ended with the Cold War. I photographed everything with my phone, then carefully returned each document to its place. The briefcase went back into its hiding spot, and I replaced the floorboard exactly as I'd found it. But even as I tried to restore normalcy, I knew there was no going back. The questions were already consuming me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my grandfather's guest room, my room now, I supposed, and stared at the ceiling while rain continued its Morse code against the windows. Every shadow seemed to hold secrets. Every sound might be footsteps from people who knew I'd found what I wasn't supposed to find. By morning, I'd made a decision that would change everything. My friend Marcus worked as a contractor for the Department of Defense, something involving cybersecurity that he was deliberately vague about. We'd known each other since college, and I trusted him more than anyone else in my life. If anyone could help me understand what I'd found, it would be him. We met at a coffee shop downtown, one of those places that stayed busy enough to provide cover for conversation. I'd brought printouts of a few of the less sensitive documents, nothing that mentioned names or specific operations, just enough to give him context. Marcus studied the papers with the intensity of someone who knew what to look for. His expression grew increasingly troubled as he read, and when he finally looked up, there was something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Fear. "Where did you get these?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "My grandfather's attic." "Marcus, is this real?" He glanced around the coffee shop, then leaned closer. "Do you have any idea what you're dealing with here? These classifications, I've never seen anything like them. Umbra clearance? That's not supposed to exist. But it does exist. That's the problem." He gathered the papers and handed them back to me. "Listen to me very carefully. Go home, burn these, and never mention them to anyone again." Marcus dash. "I'm serious. There are things the government doesn't want people to know, and there are things the government will kill people to keep secret. This feels like the second kind." His words should have scared me away. Instead, they had the opposite effect. The journalist in me, the part that had driven me to a career in investigative reporting before I'd settled into the comfortable mediocrity of freelance writing, suddenly awakened after years of dormancy. "What if I don't want to let this go?" Marcus stared at me for a long moment, then shook his head. "Then you're on your own." And whatever happens next, we never had this conversation. He left his coffee unfinished and walked out, leaving me alone with questions that felt heavier than they had before. But I'd expected this reaction. Anyone who worked within the system would be trained to avoid anything that could compromise their clearance or their career. I needed to find someone who operated outside those constraints. I spent the afternoon researching Majestic 12 online, falling down rabbit holes that led to conspiracy forums, declassified documents, and academic papers about government secrecy. Most of what I found was speculation and fantasy, but scattered through the noise were threads of genuine research by people who dedicated their lives to uncovering the truth. That evening, I made my second mistake of the week. I called my friend Sarah, a journalist with connections throughout the intelligence community, and asked if she'd ever heard of anything called Majestic 12. The line went silent for so long that I thought the caller dropped. "Where are you hearing that name?" she finally asked. "It's probably nothing. Family history stuff. Meet me tomorrow, not at my office, somewhere public, and don't mention this to anyone else until we talk." The urgency in her voice should have been another warning. Instead, it felt like validation. I wasn't chasing shadows. I was onto something real. But I never made it to that meeting. I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of breaking glass. The house was dark, but something was wrong with the darkness. It felt occupied, as if invisible presence was moving through it. I grabbed my phone and tried to call 911, but there was no signal. The landline was dead too. From somewhere below came the sound of footsteps, careful and deliberate. They moved through the house with purpose, as if the intruders knew exactly where they were going. I heard them climbing the stairs to the second floor, then the creak of the attic ladder being lowered. I hid in the bathroom and waited. The sounds from above were methodical, things being moved, floorboards being pried up, the briefcase being opened. They knew exactly where to look. 20 minutes later, the footsteps receded. I heard a vehicle start in the driveway, then fade into the distance. When I finally found the courage to investigate, the attic had been searched thoroughly, but not destructively. Nothing was damaged. Nothing was stolen. They'd simply examined everything and left. But they'd left something behind. On my kitchen table, weighted down by my grandfather's coffee mug, was a single sheet of paper with a message typed in the same font as the documents I'd found. Return what doesn't belong to you. No one will believe you anyway. The message was unsigned, but the implication was clear. They knew who I was, they knew what I'd found, and they were giving me a chance to walk away quietly. The old me, the careful, risk-averse me, might have taken that chance. But something had changed. Maybe it was reading those documents and realizing that my grandfather had spent decades keeping secrets that could reshape our understanding of reality. Maybe it was the casual way they'd invaded my home, as if my privacy and safety were irrelevant details. Or maybe it was the arrogance of that final line, "No one will believe you anyway." They were probably right, but I was going to try anyway. I found David Kellerman through a recommendation on a UFO research forum. He was a retired aerospace historian who'd spent 30 years studying the intersection of government secrecy and unexplained aerial phenomena. His academic credentials were impressive: MIT, CALTECH, positions with NASA and the RAND Corporation, but he'd sacrificed his mainstream career to pursue questions that his former colleagues considered career suicide. His office was in a strip mall between a tax preparation service and a Chinese restaurant, the kind of anonymous location that suggested someone who valued privacy over prestige. The interior looked like a library had exploded. Shelves lined every wall, stacked with books, journals and filing boxes that seemed to follow an organisational system only he understood. Kellerman himself was exactly what I'd expected. 60s, grey-beard, eyes that held the intensity of someone who'd spent years looking for patterns that others missed. He poured coffee from a pot that looked like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration and settled behind a desk covered with documents. "You mentioned Majestic 12 on the phone," he said without preamble. "That's not a term people use casually." I pulled out the photograph I'd found and placed it on his desk. Kellerman's reaction was immediate and startling. He actually recoiled as if I'd shown him something dangerous. "Where did you get this?" "My grandfather's attic. He died last week." Kellerman studied the photo with a magnifying glass, his expression growing more troubled with each face he examined. "This is... Jesus. Do you know who these people are?" "Some of them. General Twining, Admiral Hillenkoetter, the founding members of the most secret organisation in American history. These 12 men controlled information about unexplained aerial phenomena for decades. They decided what the public knew, what scientists could study, what pilots could report." He pointed to each face in turn, rattling off names and positions that painted a picture of a shadow organisation with connections throughout the military-industrial complex. But when he reached the man I'd identified as my grandfather, he paused. "I don't recognise this one. That's unusual. I thought I knew all the confirmed MJ-12 members." "That's my grandfather, James Mitchell. The back says he was inducted in 1962. Kellerman flipped the photo over and read the notation. His face went pale. "Project Doorway. I've heard that name exactly once before, in a document that was leaked and then disappeared within hours. It was supposedly some kind of advanced research initiative." but nobody knows what they were researching. What do you think they found? He looked at me for a long moment before answering. You really don't know, do you? Your grandfather never told you anything. He never talked about his work. Ever. Kellerman leaned back in his chair, studying me as if trying to determine how much truth I could handle. The conventional wisdom is that MJ-12 was formed in 1947 to investigate the Roswell incident. But the evidence suggests they were actually created to manage something much bigger, a systematic recovery and study program for non-human technology. The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. Non-human technology. Even hearing it said out loud felt surreal. You're talking about UFO-S. I'm talking about recovered materials, reverse-engineered technology, and a cover-up that's lasted 75 years. He gestured toward the photograph. These men weren't just investigating unexplained aircraft. They were trying to understand technology that was decades or centuries ahead of anything humans had developed. And my grandfather was part of this. If this photograph is authentic, then your grandfather was inducted into the most classified program in human history. Project Doorway might have been where they kept their most sensitive research, the things too dangerous or too revolutionary to share with the rest of MJ-12. Kellerman stood and moved to one of his filing cabinets, retrieving a folder thick with documents and photographs. I need you to understand something. The people who ran this program didn't just classify information. They eliminated threats. Researchers who asked too many questions disappeared. Witnesses were discredited or worse. Talking about this publicly could put you on lists you don't want to be on. Someone already broke into my house. They know I have this. His expression darkened. Then you're already on the list. The question is what you're going to do about it. I thought about my grandfather's life of careful silence, about all the questions I'd never asked, and all the answers I'd never received. Then I thought about that arrogant note left on my kitchen table, the casual assumption that I could be intimidated into compliance. I want to know the truth. All of it. Kellerman nodded slowly as if he'd expected this answer. Then we're going to need help. There are others, researchers, former military personnel, people who've been asking the same questions you're asking. But we'll need to be careful. The moment you start connecting dots publicly, they'll move to shut you down. How? However they need to. These people have resources you can't imagine and authorization you don't want to think about. But there might be a way to get ahead of them, if you're willing to take the risk. Over the next 2 hours, Kellerman outlined a plan that was equal parts brilliant and terrifying. Instead of trying to investigate MJ-12 from the outside, we would use the documents I'd found to force them into the open. By releasing carefully selected information through multiple channels simultaneously, we could create too many fires for them to contain at once. The key, he explained, is making sure the information spreads faster than they can respond. Once it's out there, they can't put it back in the bottle. It was a good plan. It might even have worked. But we never got the chance to find out. I spent the next morning at Kellerman's office, helping him scan and catalogue every document from my grandfather's briefcase. We worked methodically, creating multiple backup copies and preparing a release package that would be impossible to suppress completely. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Simultaneous uploads to WikiLeaks, multiple UFO research organisations, and several mainstream journalists who'd shown interest in government transparency issues. Kellerman had contacts throughout the UFO research community, people who'd spent years waiting for exactly this kind of evidence. Within hours, we had confirmation that major research organisations were prepared to receive and distribute the documents. Everything was in place. At 3 p.m, I uploaded the complete document package to an encrypted file-sharing service that Kellerman had used successfully for previous leaks. The upload took 47 minutes, hundreds of pages of classified documents that would finally expose the truth about decades of government deception. For exactly 12 hours, I felt like we were winning. I woke up the next morning to a house without power, internet or phone service. The silence was so complete that it took me several minutes to realise what was wrong. No humming refrigerator, no digital clocks, no background noise from electronic devices. It was as if someone had cut the house off from the modern world entirely. Outside my bedroom window, a black SUV sat at the curb with its engine running. As I watched, a second vehicle pulled up behind it. Men in dark suits got out and began setting up some kind of equipment. Dishes and antennas that suggested sophisticated surveillance technology. My phone had no signal, but its battery was mysteriously drained despite being plugged in overnight. The landline was completely dead. I was effectively isolated from the outside world, but I wasn't quite ready to panic yet. This could still be intimidation rather than preparation for something worse. That illusion lasted until I tried to check the file-sharing site using my neighbour's Wi-Fi. The documents were gone. In their place was a message that made my blood turn cold. You are now under protective surveillance for your own safety. Do not attempt to leave the area or contact outside parties until you have been debriefed. Protective surveillance. As if kidnapping became legal when the government did it. I tried every backup plan Kellerman and I had discussed. Multiple file-sharing sites, email accounts, social media platforms. Every avenue we'd prepared had been somehow compromised or blocked. It was as if an invisible hand had reached into the internet and selectively deleted only the information we'd tried to share. The technical sophistication required for that kind of operation was staggering. It wasn't enough to monitor internet traffic. They had to have real-time access to multiple private servers and the ability to alter or delete data across platforms simultaneously. The resources required suggested an operation far beyond normal law enforcement or even typical intelligence agencies. By noon, I was completely cut off. The men outside had set up a perimeter that looked professional, but not overtly threatening. More like a protective detail than an arrest team. But the message was clear. I wasn't leaving until someone decided I could leave. I spent the afternoon trying to understand what I was dealing with. Whoever these people were, they had capabilities that seemed to transcend normal government authority. They could shut down utilities, manipulate internet infrastructure, and coordinate surveillance operations without any visible oversight or legal process. But they'd also gone to elaborate lengths to avoid direct confrontation. The message had called it protective surveillance, and their behaviour suggested they wanted cooperation rather than conflict. That meant they needed something from me, information, compliance, or something else I couldn't yet identify. At 6 p.m, my doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole to see a woman in a dark business suit alone, holding what appeared to be an official government identification. She was middle-aged, professionally dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Most importantly, she didn't look like the kind of person who would kick down doors or make threats. "Mr. Mitchell," she said when I opened the door, "my name is Agent Elizabeth Morrison, and I represent a group that worked very closely with your grandfather. We need to talk." Agent Morrison's credentials identified her as working for something called Advanced Special Programs Division, which meant nothing to me but seemed genuine enough. She declined to come inside, suggesting instead that we take a drive to somewhere more secure for our conversation. "More secure for whom?" I asked. "For everyone involved. Your house is being monitored by multiple parties now, and not all of them have your best interests at heart." The statement was cryptic enough to be either a threat or a warning. Against my better judgment, I decided to trust her. Maybe it was her professional demeanour, or maybe I was simply tired of being trapped in my own home, but something about Agent Morrison seemed different from the faceless surveillance team that had been watching me. We drove in her unmarked sedan through the suburbs and then out into the desert, following highways that grew progressively emptier as we moved away from civilization. Morrison didn't speak during the drive, and I found myself studying her profile, trying to read intent in the set of her jaw and the way she gripped the steering wheel. "Where are we going?" I finally asked. "To see something your grandfather helped build." After 2 hours of driving, we turned off the main highway onto a dirt road that looked like it led nowhere. But after several miles of desert scrub and Joshua trees, a chain-link fence appeared in the distance, topped with razor wire and surrounded by warning signs about restricted military areas. The facility beyond the fence looked abandoned. Old buildings with broken windows, a few rusted antenna arrays, and what might once have been a radar installation. It looked like dozens of other Cold War-era installations scattered throughout the southwest, the kind of place that had been built quickly and abandoned just as quickly when budgets shifted or missions changed. But appearances were deceiving. Agent Morrison used a key card to open gates that looked rusty but operated smoothly. and I noticed that despite the apparent abandonment, the roads were well maintained and the power lines were clearly active. What is this place? Officially? A decommissioned early warning station that was closed in 1967. Unofficially, it's been continuously operational for 58 years. She parked in front of the largest building and led me to an entrance that was hidden from casual view. Your grandfather spent a lot of time here in the 1960s and 70s. The interior was a revelation. Beyond the facade of abandonment was a facility that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Clean corridors with modern lighting, security checkpoints with advanced scanning equipment, and an elevator that descended far deeper than should have been possible in a desert installation. "Welcome to Site 7, Morrison said as the elevator continued its descent. One of 12 facilities where we study materials that don't officially exist. The elevator opened onto a vast underground complex that stretched in multiple directions. The architecture was utilitarian but clearly expensive. Reinforced concrete, climate control systems and security measures that suggested whatever was stored here was extremely valuable or extremely dangerous. Morrison led me through corridors lined with laboratories and storage areas, past rooms filled with equipment I couldn't identify, and technicians who barely looked up from their work. The scale of the operation was staggering. This wasn't a small research facility. It was an entire underground city dedicated to purposes I couldn't yet comprehend. How long has this been here? Construction began in 1953, expanded continuously ever since. Your grandfather was one of the original planners. We stopped at a massive vault door that required multiple security protocols to open. Morrison used her keycard, submitted to a retinal scan, and entered a code that was at least 12 digits long. When the door finally opened, I found myself staring into a storage facility that looked like a combination warehouse and museum. The space was filled with display cases, each containing objects that challenged my understanding of physics and engineering. Metal fragments that seemed to shift colour as I watched them. Circuits printed on substrates that looked organic rather than synthetic. Components that hummed with energy despite having no visible power source. Recovered materials, Morrison explained simply. Things we've found at crash sites over the past 70 years. I approached the nearest display case and found myself looking at what appeared to be a piece of hull material from some kind of aircraft. But the metal, if it was metal, seemed to flow like liquid while maintaining a solid form. As I watched, patterns appeared and disappeared on its surface, as if it were responding to my presence. What am I looking at? Technology that's decades ahead of anything humans have developed. Materials that don't follow our understanding of physics. Engineering principles we still can't fully comprehend. Case after case contained similar impossible objects. Fragments of machinery that operated on principles beyond current science. Alloys that shouldn't exist. Components that seemed to generate power from nothing. It was a museum of impossibility. Proof that someone or something had solved technological challenges that humanity was still struggling to understand. But it was the far wall that stopped my breathing entirely. A grid of black and white photographs covered the entire surface. Dozens of images showing crash sites from around the world. Some I recognised from UFO research. Roswell, of course. But also incidents I'd read about in declassified Air Force documents. Others were completely unfamiliar, showing recovery operations in locations ranging from Arctic tundra to tropical forests. Each photograph was labelled with a date, location, and classification number. The dates ranged from 1947 to just last year, suggesting that whatever was crashing wasn't a historical curiosity but an ongoing phenomenon. 75 years, Morrison said quietly. 75 years of recovered materials, and we're still trying to understand how they work. Who built them? That's the question your grandfather spent his career trying to answer. I was studying a particularly clear photograph of what looked like a disc-shaped craft being loaded onto a military trailer when I heard footsteps behind us. Multiple sets of boots on concrete, moving with military precision. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for the tour, Morrison said, her tone suddenly formal and apologetic. I turned to see 6 soldiers in combat gear entering the vault, weapons lowered but ready. Unlike the surveillance team at my house, these men wore full military uniforms with unit patches I didn't recognise. "Hands where we can see them," their leader commanded, though his tone was professional rather than threatening. I raised my hands slowly, trying to process what was happening. "Agent Morrison?" But Morrison was backing away, her expression genuinely regretful. "I'm sorry. I was hoping we could resolve this differently, but the decision has been made at levels above my authority." The soldiers surrounded me without violence, clearly following protocols for handling a cooperative subject. But as they guided me toward the exit, I caught sight of something that made my blood freeze. On the wall of photographs in the bottom right corner was an image I hadn't noticed before. It showed a crash site that looked recent, emergency vehicles, military personnel, and in the background a house that looked suspiciously familiar. My grandfather's house. My house. The photograph was dated 3 days ago, the day after I'd found the briefcase in the attic. They didn't arrest me, but they didn't let me go either. Instead, I found myself in what could generously be called a conference room, but which felt more like an interrogation chamber. Windowless walls, a metal table, and chairs that were designed for function rather than comfort. I sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, trying to understand how my search for truth had led to detention in an underground government facility. When the door finally opened, the man who entered looked exactly like what Hollywood would cast as a government spook. Mid-50s, greying hair, expensive suit that managed to look both formal and threatening. He carried a manila folder and moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent decades making decisions that affected other people's lives. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, settling into the chair across from me. "My name is Director William Hayes. I represent the organisation your grandfather served for over 30 years. He opened the folder and withdrew a photograph, the same one I'd found in my grandfather's briefcase, showing 12 men in military uniforms and suits. But this copy was different. Instead of my grandfather's handwritten notation on the back, this version had an official stamp and classification marking. Majestic 12, Hayes continued, was never what people thought it was. It wasn't 12 men making decisions about UFO policy. It was 12 seats, positions that have been continuously filled by individuals with specific skills and clearances, and my grandfather held one of those seats. The 12th seat specifically. Your grandfather was recruited in 1962 because of his expertise in aerospace engineering and his security clearance, but also because of his psychological profile. We needed someone who could compartmentalize information and work on projects that challenge conventional understanding of reality. Hayes withdrew another document from the folder, a psychological evaluation with my grandfather's name and photograph. The assessment was thorough and unsettling, analysing everything from his cognitive abilities to his likelihood of developing moral objections to classified work. Project Doorway was your grandfather's primary assignment, Hayes explained. While the rest of MJ-12 focused on recovery and analysis of materials, Doorway was tasked with practical application, taking recovered technology and developing human applications. You're talking about reverse engineering? I'm talking about the most advanced research program in human history. Integrated circuits, fibre optics, advanced metallurgy, dozens of technologies that revolutionized human civilization were actually derived from materials we recovered starting in 1947. The implications were staggering. If Hayes was telling the truth, then much of modern technology wasn't the result of human innovation, but rather reverse-engineered alien science. Our computers, our communications, our material science, all of it built on a foundation of borrowed knowledge. Why are you telling me this? Because Majestic 12 never disbanded. It evolved. Hayes leaned forward, his expression becoming more intense. Government programs have limitations, oversight, budgets, political interference. But private organisations can operate with greater flexibility and fewer restrictions. You went private. We became self-sustaining. The technologies we developed generated revenue streams that funded continued research. By 1995, we were completely independent of government oversight or funding. It made a certain perverse sense. If you could reverse engineer advanced technology, you could patent and license innovations that would generate enormous profits. Those profits could fund more research, more recovery operations, more technological advancement, a self-perpetuating cycle of discovery and development that operated outside normal economic and political constraints. The question, Hayes continued, is what happens now? Your investigation has attracted attention from multiple parties, some friendly, others less so. You have a choice to make. He placed 2 items on the table between us. The first was a standard non-disclosure agreement, the kind of legal document that would bind me to silence about everything I'd seen and learned. The second was a keycard similar to the one Agent Morrison had used to access the facility. Option 1, you sign the NDA, agree never to discuss or investigate this matter further, and return to your normal life. We'll ensure your safety and provide compensation for any inconvenience you've experienced. And option 2, you take the keycard and accept an invitation to join the organisation your grandfather served. The 12th seat has been vacant since his death 3 days ago. The offer was so unexpected that I couldn't immediately process it. You want me to become part of the cover-up? I want you to become part of the solution. Hayes' expression didn't change, but his tone became more urgent. Do you think we've spent 75 years hiding this technology for fun? Do you think we enjoy keeping scientific breakthroughs locked away in underground vaults? Then why do it? Because releasing it too quickly would destabilize human civilization. Imagine if we'd introduced integrated circuit technology in 1950, or revealed anti-gravity principles in 1960. The economic, political and social disruption would have been catastrophic. Hayes stood and moved to a wall-mounted display that I hadn't noticed before. With the touch of a button, it came alive with charts and graphs showing technological advancement over the past century. We've been carefully introducing recovered technology into human civilization for decades, he explained. Each innovation is timed to coincide with humanity's ability to understand and integrate it safely. We're not suppressing progress, we're managing it. The display showed a timeline that was both fascinating and disturbing. Major technological breakthroughs that I'd assumed were human achievements were actually marked as controlled releases of recovered technology. The transistor, laser technology, stealth aircraft design, all of it apparently derived from non-human sources, but introduced gradually to avoid societal shock. Your grandfather understood this, Hayes continued. He spent 30 years helping us determine what humanity was ready to know and when they were ready to know it. The 12th seat has always been responsible for this delicate balance. And if I refuse both options? Hayes returned to his chair and for the first time his professional composure slipped slightly. Then you become a security risk that needs to be managed. We prefer cooperation, but we will protect this program by any means necessary. The threat was politely delivered but unmistakable. I could join them, be silenced by legal agreement, or be silenced by other means. But there was something else in his expression, a hope that I would choose cooperation over coercion. I need time to think. Time is a luxury we don't have. Your investigation has already attracted attention from foreign intelligence services and radical transparency groups. Every hour you remain uncommitted increases the risk of exposure. Hayes withdrew one final document from his folder, an intelligence briefing that showed my photograph alongside analysis of my online activities, social connections and potential security risks. They'd been watching me far longer than I'd realised, probably since the moment I'd mentioned Majestic 12 to Marcus. If you accept the position, you'll have access to technologies that could revolutionise human understanding of physics, energy and space travel. You'll be part of the most important scientific endeavour in history, and if I try to expose what I've learned, then you'll join a long list of people who tried to reveal secrets they didn't understand. Some were discredited, others simply disappeared. A few suffered more creative fates. The casual way he mentioned murder made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to consider the offer objectively. If everything Hayes had told me was true, if there really was recovered non-human technology being slowly integrated into human civilization, then perhaps controlled disclosure was better than chaos. But there was something about the entire setup that felt wrong. The underground facility, the private organisation operating without oversight, the casual threats against anyone who might expose the truth. Even if their intentions were good, the methods felt like something from a totalitarian nightmare. What happened to the other 11 seats? They're still filled. The organisation has evolved, but the structure remains the same. 12 individuals with different specialties working together to manage humanity's relationship with non-terrestrial intelligence. Non-terrestrial intelligence? You're admitting these materials came from aliens? Hayes smiled for the first time since entering the room, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. Mr. Mitchell, that's the least shocking thing you'll learn if you accept this position. I made my decision at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, sitting in my grandfather's kitchen and staring at the keycard Director Hayes had given me. They'd returned me to my house with a 12-hour deadline, promising that my choice would be final and irreversible. The surveillance team was still outside, but their presence had shifted from threatening to protective. Agent Morrison had stopped by earlier to explain that foreign intelligence services were now actively searching for me, having detected the brief leak of classified documents. Whether I joined the organisation or simply signed an NDA, I would need their protection. I'd spent hours reading everything I could find about my grandfather's military service, looking for clues about the man who'd kept such enormous secrets for so many years. His commendations were impressive but vague, full of references to special projects and classified contributions to national security. Between the lines, I could see the outline of a man who'd struggled with the weight of knowledge he couldn't share. There was a journal I'd found in his desk, mostly mundane entries about daily life and family events, but scattered throughout were cryptic references that made more sense now that I understood his real work. Made progress on the translation project today, he'd written in 1968. The mathematics are unlike anything we've seen before. Translation project, as if he'd been trying to understand instructions written in a non-human language. The most revealing entry was from 1985. 23 years of this work, and I still don't know if we're preparing humanity for the future, or betraying it to forces we don't understand, but the alternative, chaos, panic, the collapse of everything we've built, seems worse than continuing down this path. My grandfather had wrestled with the same choice I was facing now. Join a conspiracy that might be protecting humanity, or risk exposing truths that could destroy the foundations of human civilization. At 4 a.m, I made my choice. I walked to my front door and opened it slowly. Agent Morrison was waiting on the porch, as if she'd known this moment would come. "Have you decided?" she asked. I looked at the key card in my hand, then at the surveillance vehicles that had become as familiar as the landscape. Beyond them, the desert stretched toward mountains that looked like sleeping giants in the pre-dawn darkness. "My grandfather kept these secrets for 30 years, I said finally. "How did he live with it?" He understood that some truths are too dangerous for democracy to handle, but that doesn't mean they should be hidden forever, just managed carefully until humanity is ready. "And you think I'm ready to make those decisions?" Morrison's expression was genuinely sympathetic. "I think you're the only one who can. Your grandfather chose you for this role long before you found that briefcase. Why do you think he kept it where you would find it after his death?" The implication hit me like cold water. The briefcase hadn't been hidden from me. It had been preserved for me. My grandfather had spent his final years preparing for this moment, when his secrets would become my responsibility. "The 12th seat," I said quietly. "Welcome to Majestic 12, Mr. Mitchell." I handed her the key card, then walked back into the house that now felt like someone else's life. In 12 hours, I would report to Site 7 for orientation and briefing. I would learn about technologies that shouldn't exist, about contact with intelligences that weren't human, about decisions that shaped the future of human civilization. But first, I had one final task to complete. I sat at my grandfather's desk and opened a new document on my laptop. If I was going to join the conspiracy, I was going to document everything I could remember about the journey that brought me here. Not for publication, I understood now that some secrets had to be kept, but for the person who would someday find themselves in my position. Because there would always be a 12th seat, and it would always need to be filled by someone willing to bear the weight of impossible knowledge. I began typing, "If you're reading this, then you found what I left for you to find." The briefcase was just the beginning. What follows is the real story, the one they don't tell you until after you've already agreed to carry it forward. Outside, the sun was rising over the desert, painting the mountains in shades of gold and red. It looked like the dawn of a new world, which I supposed it was, at least for me. 3 months later, I was sitting in a conference room beneath Site 7, surrounded by 11 other people who'd made the same choice I had made. We were reviewing intelligence reports about a crash in northern Canada, discussing recovery protocols and containment procedures with the casual professionalism of people who'd spent years managing the impossible. The work was exactly as advertised. Fascinating, terrifying, and absolutely necessary. Every day brought new evidence that humanity was not alone in the universe, and every day brought new decisions about how much of that truth the world was ready to handle. I thought about my grandfather often, wondering if he'd felt the same mix of pride and guilt that consumed me now. We were guardians of humanity's future, protectors of civilization's stability, and keepers of secrets that could transform or destroy everything humans had built. But late at night, when I returned to the house that now felt more like a museum than a home, I sometimes wondered about the road not taken. What if I had chosen transparency over secrecy? What if I had tried to tell the world about recovered technology and non-human intelligence? Would humanity have been ready for that truth? Or would it have torn apart the fabric of civilization, just as Director Hayes had warned? I supposed I would never know. But every morning I woke up and chose to believe that gradual disclosure was better than sudden chaos, that managed truth was better than devastating revelation. After all, that's what the 12th seat was for, to make the hard choices so others didn't have to. And if someday I was wrong, if the secrecy caused more harm than transparency would have, well, hopefully the person who inherited my position would be wiser than I had been. The briefcase was waiting in the attic, exactly where my grandfather had left it, exactly where I would leave it when my time came, along with a letter that began, "If you're reading this, then you found what I left for you to find." Some traditions, it seemed, were worth preserving, even the secret ones.